Okay, so here we are on our first ever podcast episode with myself, Adele, and Sam Selye. And today we're going to be talking about good stress and bad stress. Yeah, where do we begin? What is stress, Sam?
What is stress? Well, stress is a natural physiological and psychological response to some form of demand in the body. And that can be pressure, it can be triggers from the outside world, it can be industrial chemicals, emotional stress. One of the things that we need to be mindful of is that the brain does and the body doesn't recognize the differentiate of stress. So stress is stress to the body. The same physiological and emotional response and mental response will be initiated. And it's quite a complex response that's initiated during the
It really is. And there was actually a researcher called Selye who he developed a whole he did a lot of, he's like the father of stress management and research, and he did this whole model called the General Adaptation Syndrome, GAS. And this piece of work really looked at the three different stages of alarm, resistance, and exhaustion. Let's talk a little bit about how the body responds to prolonged stress and what are all the physiological changes and the depletion that happens, because I think we can all relate to like feeling like that. Like on the 1 minute you're doing well, and then it's almost like it hits a threshold and then we're not well, and now we're in distress. Let's just see if we can define a little bit about this.
Yeah, so Hans Selye, however you want to pronounce it, very much part of the global film. He was a really forward-thinking researcher, wasn't he, for his time? He was right in 1996, he came up with this adaptation response. And so when we look at that alarm response, I just want to really highlight first that that's a response that you actually feel in your body first. And your body then initiates this release of cortisol. And that cortisol then mobilizes, so you've got glucose mobilization, your immune system gets suppressed, you're ready to fight. That's why it's called like a fight and flight response. And that's designed for short bursts of stress. And then you can move into a resistance phase where it's a bit longer. And then you move into that exhaustion phase, which is when it starts to really impact, and you can see it on the mental, emotional, and physical body because it's designed for short bursts.
Yeah.
One of the things that we need to be mindful of is that the body experiences it first, but the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and the adrenal glands are critical to that stress response. So that's your hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenal glands, which is called the HPA axis. And it's beautifully orchestrated, starting off in the hypothalamus. Again, the hypothalamus doesn't identify what the stress is. It sends this hormone, adrenal corticotropic hormone, to the pituitary gland. And then that then sends another signal to the adrenal glands. And then by that point, you've also got adrenaline and noradrenaline being produced. And that's when you start to get like the racing heart, you start to get these cardiac type symptoms.
Yeah.
Glucose being mobilized so that if you need to run from the tiger, you can run from the tiger. So yeah, it's quite a unique response, but long term does cause havoc to the body. I think one of the key things that you'll see is sleep disturbance is going to be one of the key things that you see.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, from a trauma perspective, Stephen Porges's polyvagal theory really looks quite elegantly at like, we can be in this really normalized zone where we're connected to ourselves, connected to other people. And then a trigger can hit where we move into the sympathetic nervous system and the HPA axis actually being, activated. And we fight, flee, or fix in this moment. We're like, but it's busy. There's lots of stuff happening at this point. But then to your point, if you move to this place where it starts to overcook it, then you move into the other side of the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the dorsal vagal side, where we freeze. And we freeze or fawn. And this freeze and collapse zone is really where that total exhaustion can happen. So stress is a sweet spot. And, it's one of those things you can push And if you don't have any stress, you can't produce anything. But if you push too hard, it can push yourself right the way to the other side where you actually can be distressed and unwell. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so you're referring to like moving from the eustress, which is like the healthy type stress, which we can also kind of call like hormesis, where we require some stress to motivate us and to drive us to get things done. And that's that sweet spot. But when it moves into distress, then you can start to get these real somatic symptoms that start to come across, like tachycardia, all that racing heartbeat,
Yeah.
ability to sleep, feeling really kind of irritable and angry because you're in this sympathetic dominant mode that's a stress response mode all the time.
Yeah.
And at these prolonged levels of cortisol, cortisol prevents a lot of things happening in the body because it's designed for that acute stuff that we talked about. It interferes with sleep, it interferes with digestion, so you can start to get digestive complaints, not feeling so good after eating and not digesting your food so well. You might become emotionally challenged, so a bit more teary and irritable, and things that wouldn't normally or wash off you start to have an impact on you. And that's when you can start heading in this kind of trajectory of burnout. I mean, let's talk about burnout. So many people are burned out because unless they're seen to be doing in our society now rather than being, then you're not successful in the world. And that's quite interesting. And I think, we've briefly touched on that you can be addicted to stress.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Well, and stress can be, to a lot of people, it can be real badge of honor. We sort of, I'm wanted, I'm needed, I'm busy, I'm doing all this stuff. And it's like the more stuff I'm doing, the more stressed I am. There's sometimes like a coolness that is associated to being stressed. But a lot of people don't recognize how our nervous system is actually quite a delicate system. And when it's not in homeostasis, we both work with people on the psychological side of burnout, on the health side of burnout. And most people, it caught them off guard. Like they thought they could handle it. And there's a level where we all have to challenge ourselves. Are we being a bit arrogant about how much we can do? Oh, I'm fine. I'm just going to take on all this stuff. I've got this. I'm onto it. I'm a legend. I'm managing my stress. And the next minute it's like, I'm tired. I'm burnt out. I'm frozen. I'm in collapse and I can't get up now. And from a brain perspective, there've been studies done on when there's too much cortisol, and it's very interesting what it actually does with the hippocampus within the brain. Too much cortisol, it actually causes the receptors and the villi that are actually in the hippocampus to shrivel up. We can't think straight. So when people are psychologically in that state of stress, too much cortisol is bad. So it's a bit like Goldilocks and the three bears. You don't want the porridge too cold, where you have no stress, you can't do anything. You don't want it too sweet, where it's like over the top. You want it like just right. And we've got to sort of figure out, how do you get it just in that middle zone where stress can be good and it isn't this negative thing that pushes you completely over the edge.
I think what you're referring to there is called the allostatic load, and that's the allostatic load concept, and that's around the cumulative wear and tear of what stress does to your body. And I just really want to labor on this cortisol. So when you have long-standing levels of cortisol, your liver's got to clear all of that as well. It does cause so much havoc with the body. It really does. It causes a disruption to your endocrine system, your nervous system. I like to think of it as a bit of like brain fog. The endocrine system, for example, is that it starts to disrupt your metabolism, and you start to gain a little bit more weight. Then when you gain more weight, then it becomes this kind of cascading event of things that happen in the body. And so high cortisol causes weight gain. Weight gain causes a pro-inflammatory system, and then you start to get aches and joints and pains and all this somatic stuff that shows up as a result of long-term cortisol. And then, there's cortisol. You can't sleep when you've got circulation running with cortisol. Cortisol's got like a nocturnal or diurnal rhythm. it's got like 4 peaks. It's at its highest about whatever your time of waking up in the morning is. Mine's about 5:30, right? So I get this big peak so that my blood pressure can get elevated to get out of bed and do all the things that I need to get to. Then we get another dip about midday. Then we get another little dip about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And then we get another dip about 7 o'clock at night, 8 o'clock at night. So it does that. And it's beautifully orchestrated. Long-term stress, you can see it turn upside down. So people start to get really fatigued through the day because they're not getting those cortisol peaks. And then they're wide awake at night.
So it really influences your circadian rhythm and melatonin production as well, right?
Absolutely. And how it affects your hormonal areas and your diet. So how it impacts on your serotonin, your GABA, and your dopamine pathways. So those are all the neurotransmitters, some of the neurotransmitters that make you feel good and happy and regulate motivation and down-regulate addiction and all of those things. And then you've got like the dopamine, like histamine, for example. So stress can actually cause, cortisol can actually cause an elevation of histamine. So people start to get allergies and intolerances to things, and we've got histamine receptors in every single cell in our body except our retinas. And so it starts to become a systemic response in response to this high cortisol. So, I mean, that's just touching on what long levels of cortisol can actually do. So, but there's things that we can do, of course, that can help with the stress response. And I'm really interested in what you do in your work, which is around stress resilience, the psychological work that you do.
So I think, the first part is really recognizing all the sources of stress. We call them stressors from a psychological perspective. And, there are many different models of examining stressors. And I really like, there's a really cool book that I read recently, Solving for Happy by Mo Goddard. And he has this nice little simple model with 4 different areas. So rather than kind of quantifying financial stress or health stress and quantifying by subject matter, because, well, we can all say we have stress, it's actually quantifying it by the type of stress that comes in. And you have macro, micro type stressors that come in. And the first is this idea of trauma. And trauma is, significant life-altering events that just come and crash into your world and produces emotional loss, produces suffering, and like the loss of a loved one or a big accident or a major illness that you've actually experienced. And they are usually they have a lasting impact. They take quite a long time to get over. So when you have that coming in, of course you're going to be stressed. You're going to have a stress response. Your sympathetic nervous system, your parasympathetic nervous system is going to be affected by that. The next is the next 3 are a little bit more under our control. So, the first one, obviously outside of control, but the next 3 is a little bit like where we can manage these a bit more proactively ourselves. This is obsessions. So obsessions are these repetitive thoughts or worries that consume a lot of our mental space. They are usually things we can't control. They usually involve the future. And the example, like worrying about finances, worrying about the relationship that we're in, our career progression, just stuff that we're constantly obsessing and worrying about. And they keep us fixated usually on achieving or avoiding something. And they pull us away from the present moment because we're in our heads like pontificating and navel gazing about this stuff. The next one is nuisances, which are just these kind of really minor irritations and inconveniences that just disrupt daily routines. Things like traffic jams, long lines, bank queues, text messages we have to respond to, please call your bank, call this number. And then you stay on the phone for like 26 minutes and you're like, rah. Lots of nuisances, they're temporary, they're manageable, but they can feel overwhelming if you have too many of them in a day. And noise. Noise is the final one, which is this kind of overwhelming influx of data and information. They reckon that in any given day, we have about 256 billion bits of data that is actually rushing into us. And we've got to be really careful how much of this we're exposing ourselves to. Lots of news, social media, gossip, unimportant notifications and email pop-ups and things that pop up all the time. And it clouds our focus and makes it much harder for us to prioritize what really matters. And if you sort of see things in these 4 quadrants, you start to develop a plan for how you can manage that. Like trauma, you need to go on a kind of recovery program for that, because that has lasting consequences and it's a real external thing. But these 3 are habits. This is, what are we doing day to day to have boundaries and actually manage these things a little bit better? And this is where people have a lot more control than they imagine.
Yeah, so you have to kind of think of it as like a rehabilitation, and not rehabilitation as in like the social construct of rehabilitation and addiction, but rehabilitation in that there's another way to be in the world, right? And I think while you're dealing with somebody, managing your stress and building stress resilience and emotional resilience, because emotional resilience does decline quite rapidly under long-term stress. And there's some herbal things that you can also do. And one of our herbal medicine is that we have these amazing herbs that work directly with the HPA axis.
Yay!
Like all your other stuff. And these herbs are amazing. So we've got things like ashwagandha or vithania, as people commonly know it, but ashwagandha is a popular Ayurvedic name. And that works, that we call that an adaptogenic, and it works directly through the hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenal glands. And it helps that kind of general adaptation that Selye talks about. So it helps you kind of adapt and restore the adrenal glands. Because your cortisol and your adrenaline and noradrenaline all come from the adrenal glands, one from the outside of the adrenal glands and some of the adrenal cortex. And it reduces cortisol levels. And I think that's one of the key things that we need to do is reduce cortisol levels. Right?
Yeah.
It also metabolize cortisol levels. So you've got things like phospholipid complexes that can do that as well, that just help the resilience of the cells in taking up cortisol. So modulates GABA signaling. So GABA is a lovely immune which is involved in just it's an inhibitory neurotransmitter. So that can be a really nice one you can take. You can make cups of tea with it with some nice plant-based milk, or and you can have it as a herbal extract. Then you've got rhodiola, that's a lovely beautiful herb as well. Holy basil, passion flower. And the thing about these herbs is that they've got so many multiple actions. And then once you put this herbal formula in a bottle, I like to think of them as like it becomes this intelligent blend. Because then you've got all these kind of creators of doing really good things in the cell. And the thing about herbal medicine is that herbs seem to know where to go.
I love that. How do they know, though?
How do they know? Well, there's a really amazing chap called Professor Kerry Bowen who talks about the intelligence of herbs. And if you haven't heard Kerry Bowen speak, he's got his own YouTube channel, Professor Kerry Bowen. I would go in and listen to his work. He's one of the leading herbalists in the world. And he talks a lot about the intelligence of herbs in a bottle. So that's an adaptogenic herbs. Then we've also got our nervine herbs, which are again our lemon balm and passion flower that I mentioned. And then we have supporting herbs like American ginseng, which work to tonify the adrenal glands, anti-inflammatory. So we've got reishi and shiitake mushrooms that support the adrenal glands, reduce inflammation, improve sleep quality. So you can start to see there's a whole raft of things that you can do, and you can inform a choice on how am I going to move out of being sleep frazzled all the time and addicted, and that habitual thing you talked about with stress. Like I put my hands up there too. Like I can be one of those people that go, oh, you have that stress. Like actually got addicted to cortisol and adrenaline. Because of what it does to my system. There's something quite settling for me. There's that real sweet spot of, oh no.
Yeah. And I think the thing, we underestimate when we take things on what the fallout is of the things that we take on. Anything that we add into the mix there's a whole bunch of actions and stuff that falls out from that. And we underestimate, well, how much of that can we actually handle and do? So we can get super excited about taking things on, and then next minute we've overcooked it. And there really is an equation for stress. I mean, the number of stresses times the intensity of that stress times time times application times frequency. So it's sort of like the more of a lot of a lotness of all the things that you have on there, the next minute your allostatic load just goes over that threshold where it goes from you stress straight into distress. And the body will keep the score. And you've got to kind of see if you trust the niggles that you're having. If you have a sore throat, you start to notice there's some things happening within the body. This is your time and signal for yourself to pull out of the place that you're in. You're overcooking it now.
Agreed. And I think there's some really important considerations in this as well, is that we do tend to compare ourselves to others. It's just the human being, right? And I think there's important considerations about your genotype, like there's genetic considerations. You might have inherited some, slips, as we call them, where your response to stress is less than, say, your colleagues situates throughout the day.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And what your current health, if you've got concomitant health conditions, are you on medications? What's your diet like? What's your lifestyle like in terms of exercise? What's your relationships like at home with your significant other, with your mother, with your children? It's all of those things that are in the melting pot as to how you manage and cope with stress.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's some really important questions you can ask yourself if you're sort of wondering where you're at with all of it. I think first thing is like, what is the stuff you tell yourself? What are some of these obsessions that you're obsessing over all the time? Are you being dragged or are you being driven? Are you reacting and dragged through life, or are you actually intentionally focusing on some things in life? And how many of the stresses that you experience are actually external, and how many have you actually chosen and taken on? How many of them are coming at you, and how many have you actually of your own creation and addiction manifested and made for yourself? And how often when you're in that position do you actually remember, oh, hang on a sec, I chose this. I chose all this stuff. And this is the fallout that comes from this, and why haven't you set boundaries? Why are you not saying no? Why are you scrolling on your phone for 10 hours a day? And why are you pushing yourself so hard? I think some of these questions they're just sort of guiding. Well, how much of the situation actually of my own creation?
Yeah, and I think you raise a really good point there, is that external, internal stressors, and so like we often make our own stressors and we get brought into our own dramas because that's what we know and we've been conditioned. But some stressors you just can't avoid, like they just put upon you like a certain way to be in the world. And when you were talking there just now, and I coach Oscar Wilde, he said, just be yourself, everybody else is taken. And I think one thing I've recognized as I'm getting older is that that's actually quite attractive for me, is just to be myself. And so I'm having to work journey, and I know that you're similar in pathway, is that what is it that is my sweet spot where I can be myself, have this colorful life, have a little bit of stress here and there, and fortunately have good health, because of course health is everything. When you don't have health is a massive stressor, which is often out of your control. But we're going to talk more and more about this. That we've got so many episodes coming up in the stress, right? But I think take homes today are definitely lifestyle modifications, like mind body practices that you practice with your business and your clinic, that nutritional and herbal support, and then we just touched on before we jump on as well as those blue zones, like looking at, be curious about these blue zones in the world. Like, why do they have this long, happy life? And there's so many factors that are involved in that. And it's not just diet, but primarily it's being around your mastermind, if you like, being around your tribe, people that have got your back, want the best for you, and you've got that social integration in the world.
Definitely. And I mean, there's been really good research. I think it was Shelley Taylor that talked about how social connections can really mediate and they're a protective factor against stress. And a lot of people that are very, very stressed are actually lonely. They kind of like taking on all this stuff as a replacement for connection. And that's why, it's interesting when we do assessments at Naked Recovery on people and where they're at. We're always checking to see, well, how often are you using on your phone? Can you open your phone and tell us how many hours a day are you on your phone? And the more exposure to social media and that kind of lack of actual real connection with people, stress kind of goes along with it, and mental health conditions metastasize as a result of it. So I think in the next podcast, we want to be looking a little bit at perfectionism as well as a focus of the type of people that get stressed are often really perfectionists. And a model that we want to introduce for getting out of that cycle where you're living more intentionally and less reactionally, and kind of building towards your own resiliency rather than trying to get everything perfect and live up to the Joneses, or trying to hit some kind of standard that you've put out there for yourself.
Yeah, and the book is basically with that perfectionist type personality. The book is just getting further and further away because
Always.
unattainable, isn't it? So I'm really looking forward to discussing that at our
I know. It should be good. Yeah.
Looking forward to sharing our naked insights with you, and we're using all the things health, relationship, and trauma. Till then, take care.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.
The information shared on the Naked Insights podcast is for educational and information purposes only, and is not intended as a substitute for professional therapy or counseling. While we aim to provide helpful and accurate insights, individual experiences may vary. If you're experiencing trauma, mental health issues, or distress, please seek guidance from a qualified professional. The views expressed by us as the hosts are our own and do not necessarily reflect the opinions or positions of any affiliated organizations.